There is a full cup of hot tallow going through a fine wire strainer right now, straight down onto a steak thick enough to cover this whole board, and it is hissing before it even lands. The strainer is not there to catch anything. It is there to break one stream of fat into 100 smaller ones so that instead of one lazy pour drowning the crust, you get dozens of thin falling threads finding every low spot in that sear at once. Each thread is already close to smoking by the time it lands, which means it does not sit and soak in. It flashes against the meat and seasons the crust before it has any chance to cool the pan underneath it, and a spoon can never lay fat down that even, no matter how careful the hand holding it. I have poured tallow over a steak this way more times than I could ever sit here and count for you. And in all those years, I have never once shown a camera the whole of it, start to finish. My own nephew has stood at this counter more Saturdays than I can count and asked me flat out what I'm doing with that strainer. And every single time I told him to hand me the tongs and pay attention instead of asking. So let me tell you plainly what this is not. It is not a basting spoon somebody dressed up for a video. It is not a trick that only works on camera. It is not a shortcut around a hot pan. There is a second cut resting under foil at the end of this counter right now. And before we are through tonight, I am going to open that foil and show you exactly what 40 minutes of patience does to a piece of meat. Not yet, though, that comes when it is earned. And here is what I need you to understand before we go one single step further. Tonight is 45 ways to cook a steak the old way, the way a working butcher did it, before there was a gadget on a shelf for every single job a pan and a fire used to do on their own. And this list does not stop at one steak in one skillet. It opens up the whole of a butcher's counter. Everything I ever learned about heat, fat, and time standing on the working side of that glass. My name is Frank Miller. I have stood behind a block for the better part of my life, and before that I stood behind my own father while he ran that same block. I have cut for more families than I could name if you gave me an hour to try, and I have watched every one of them cook the same good piece of meat two different ways, one that respected it and one that wasted it. Most of what separates those two ways has nothing to do with what the animal cost you at the counter. It has to do with what you do to it in the last few minutes before it hits a plate. And here is the part I want sitting with you before we go any further tonight. A man can buy the finest cut on the whole counter and still ruin it in 90 seconds of carelessness. And a man who knows exactly what he's doing can take the cheapest cut on that same counter and make somebody's whole week out of it. I have watched both of those things happen more times than I have watched anything else in my life. Some of you are going to wonder why 45 and not an even 50. The truth is, I did not sit down chasing a round number. I sat down and wrote out every single thing I actually know to be true about a piece of meat and a hot pan. And when I ran out, it landed on 45. A number you earn honestly always beats one you picked for how it looks on a thumbnail. So let me count you down through 45 things I know to be true about heat and fat and a piece of meat, working backward from the far end toward the one that brought you here tonight. Tell me down in the comments where you're watching this from, and stay with me. Now, before I get into it, one thing and one time only, there is more of this than I can fit in any video. How to shop Costco without getting taken. What every cut is really worth and the words to say at the counter to get it. How to cut and prepare your own meat the way we do it behind the block. Dry aging in your own refrigerator. And every recipe I never gave out, I put all of it in a book at frankmillerbutcher.com. Link in my bio or scan the code on your screen. That is the only time you will hear me say it. Now let us get back to the meat. Number 45, salt a steak heavy enough that it looks buried, and do it the night before instead of on the way to the stove. Most people give a steak a shake of salt on the way to the pan, and by the time it hits the heat, that salt hasn't done one thing but sit on the surface. Salt it heavy the night before instead, uncovered, sitting on a rack in your refrigerator, and overnight that salt pulls the moisture up out of the meat, dissolves into it, and gets drawn right back down into the muscle. Instead of just dusting the outside, the surface dries out at the same time. And a dry surface is the whole difference between a steak that sears and a steak that steams in its own water. This one habit, done every single time, will change more suppers in your house than any pan you could go out and buy. Number 44, never throw a good piece of fat trim in the bin while there's still tallow left in it. Every steak I cut leaves scraps of hard white fat behind that most people never think twice about. Render that fat down low and slow in its own pot, strain it clean, and keep it in a jar for exactly this. That's what's coming through the strainer at the top of this video. And it started as trim somebody else would have thrown away without a second look. That steak on the board is still sitting there patient while we talk, and I have not told you one word yet of what that strainer does to it. Number 43, never trust a hot pan by the clock, trust it by what's sitting in it. Drop a single bead of water into that skillet before the fat ever goes in. If it sits there and hisses weakly, your pan isn't ready yet. If it dances across the surface in one tight bead and disappears in a couple of seconds, that pan has found its heat. A clock tells you how long you've had the burner on. It tells you nothing about what's actually happening in that metal, and a pan that isn't hot enough will cost you the crust no matter how patient you were getting there. Number 42, let your steak sit out on the counter before it ever sees a flame. A steak straight out of a cold refrigerator fights the heat the whole way through, cooking gray and tough on the outside long before the center ever catches up. Give it a real half hour sitting out, and the whole thing cooks closer to even, edge to center, instead of you chasing a warm middle inside a ring of overdone meat. We're close enough now that I can tell you plainly that tallow is not finished with its work yet, and neither are we. Number 41, pat that steak bone dry on every face before it ever meets fat. Any water sitting on the surface has to boil off before browning can start, and boiling off water spends heat you needed for building a crust instead. Press a towel firmly against every side of that steak right before it goes in. You'll cut your searing time down and come away with a deeper crust in the same breath. A wet steak spends its first minute fighting your pan. A dry one gets straight to work. Number 40, find the direction the fibers run before your knife ever touches that steak once it's rested. They lay out like grain in a board running one way through the muscle, and on some cuts, that direction shifts part way across. So look again before you finish the cut rather than trusting the first angle the whole way through. Number 39, slice against that grain, not with it. Cutting across those fibers does most of the chewing for whoever's about to eat it. A tough, cheap cut sliced against the grain eats tender. A tender, expensive cut sliced with the grain by mistake eats like a rope. And I have watched a good steak get ruined at the cutting board after it did everything right in the pan. Somebody asked me once why I bother explaining the why behind every one of these instead of just handing out the list plain. And my honest answer is that a rule you understand you'll still be using 20 years from now, a rule you just memorized, you'll forget the first time your kitchen doesn't look exactly like mine. Number 38, look for the cap wrapped around the outside edge of a ribeye before you ever pick up the tray. That crescent of darker, looser grained meat sitting apart from the round eye in the middle is the single best piece of meat on the whole steer. And because a ribeye gets sliced off one long roast, one steak after another, some trays carry a wide, generous crescent of that cap, and some carry almost none of it at the very same price. Look before you reach. Number 37, ask for a chuck eye by name the next time you're standing at a counter. It sits just a few inches forward of where a ribeye gets cut off, that very same long muscle running down the animal's back. Same fiber, same marbling, sold at a fraction of the price because of where a saw happened to land that particular morning, and nothing more honest than that. Number 36, ask your counter for the cuts that never make it into the case at all. The hanger, one to an animal, carries enormous beefy flavor and built whole small restaurants around itself because it was cheap and nobody else wanted it. The teres major sits buried in the shoulder, shaped like a small tenderloin, and eats almost like one. None of it sits on a shelf, and every bit of it exists the moment somebody actually asks for it by name. That steak's been resting under its foil this whole time, quiet, and it is closer to its turn than you'd think sitting there watching it do nothing. Number 35, buy the whole loin instead of the pre-cut tray whenever your case offers it. A man in the back cut that tray for you, and you paid for his time along with the meat, the film, the pad, and the printed label. Buy the whole piece sealed in its bag instead, and 15 minutes with one sharp knife at your own counter hands you steaks, a roast, and a bowl of trim for exactly the kind of tallow we started with tonight. Number 34, do not put much weight on the grade stamped on that package. Quality grading isn't an inspection, it's a paid assessment at one small cross section of one muscle at one single point on the whole carcass, and it tells you almost nothing about the same animal's shoulder sitting 4 feet away in the same case. Look at the marbling in front of your own eyes instead, that either sits there or it doesn't, and no sticker changes what your eyes can plainly see. Number 33, read the label for the words blade tenderized or mechanically tenderized, and if you see them, do not serve that piece rare. A machine pressing thin blades into the surface to soften it carries whatever sits on the outside down into the middle, and that changes how it needs to be cooked clean through. This is not a place to trust an old habit over a plain warning printed right there for you. Number 32, stop expecting a marinade to reach the center of a thick steak. I have cut open marinated steaks and looked at the cross-section more times than I can count, and a few millimeters of real penetration after a full night is the honest truth of it. Salt travels because it's a small ion that moves through the muscle, and acid or a sugar sitting in a marinade simply doesn't move the same way. A thin cut like skirt or flank is the one honest exception where a marinade reaches a real share of the whole piece. I want to stop here for 1 minute and tell you something that has nothing to do with technique. My father used to say a steak doesn't know what it cost you, it only knows what you did to it once it got home. I didn't understand that sentence until I was probably 40 years old myself, standing at my own stove, finally seeing what he meant. Number 31, understand the real difference between salting a steak at the last second and salting it early enough to matter. Salt at the very end only ever seasons the first thin layer. Salt applied hours ahead has time to dissolve into a brine and get pulled back down into the muscle, seasoning the steak from the inside instead of just dusting the outside of it, which is the very same principle sitting under number 45 tonight. And if you remember one thing from this whole list, that's the one to keep. Number 30, reverse sear a thick steak instead of going straight to a hot pan. Cook it low and slow in the oven first. Pull it once it's just short of your target temperature, and only then finish it in a screaming hot skillet for the crust. That steak comes out of the oven looking almost disappointingly pale, and that's exactly the point. All the work of getting it warm clear through has already happened gently, so the pan's only job left is building a crust, not cooking the center at the same time. Number 29, start a thick steak in a stone-cold pan instead of a screaming hot one, and let the heat build underneath it slowly together. It sounds backward to anybody who's been taught a hot pan is the whole secret, but a thick cut given a slow, gradual climb renders its own fat cap evenly along the way and never shocks the outside faster than the middle can keep up. It's the same idea as a reverse sear worked from the stovetop instead of the oven. Number 28. Baste a resting sear with foaming butter instead of leaving it to sit in a dry pan. Tilt the skillet toward you so the butter pools deep on one side and spoon it up and over the steak again and again while it foams. That butter is carrying heat straight to the top of the steak the whole time the bottom is already building its crust, cooking both sides at once instead of one at a time. Number 27, drop a few whole cloves of garlic and a bundle of thyme into that same butter while you baste. The garlic goes soft and sweet sitting in all that heat, and every spoonful of butter you lift after that carries its flavor straight back onto the meat. By the time that steak comes out, the garlic's done as much work as the fire has. That resting steak under its foil has been doing quiet work of its own this whole time, and it's got less waiting left in front of it than behind it now. Number 26, forget the rule that says only flip a steak once. That rule was built for a thin cut in a hurry, not a thick one you actually care about. Flipping every 30 seconds or so keeps both sides gaining heat together instead of one side racing ahead while the other one plays catch up, and you end up with a more even cooked clear through without ever babysitting a thermometer to get there. Number 25, rest a steak on a board sauce instead of a bare cutting board. Chop garlic, herbs, and a little oil right into the wood before that steak ever touches down, so every drop of juice it lets go while it rests lands straight into that dressing instead of running off and going to waste on the counter. Number 24, once you've sliced it, pour every bit of that board sauce back over the meat before it goes to the table. Nothing in that puddle is wasted seasoning. It's the steak's own juice mixed with fat and garlic, and it belongs back on the plate it came from. Number 23, learn the hand test before you ever trust it completely. Press the pad of your thumb to your palm at different finger positions and feel how the muscle firms up from soft at a relaxed hand to firm at a clenched fist. And that same range of give is roughly what a steak feels like from rare to well done. It will never replace a real thermometer, but it'll teach your hand what those stages actually feel like faster than any chart ever will. Number 22, buy a real probe thermometer and stop guessing on anything that matters. A hand test is a fine second opinion once you've got some miles behind you, but there's no shame at all in trusting a number over a feeling, especially on a cut expensive enough that a mistake actually cost you something. I've had young cooks tell me they feel like they're cheating using a thermometer instead of just knowing. I tell them every single time that the steak on the plate doesn't care one bit how you knew it was done. It only cares that you were right. Number 21, save the marrow the next time you're breaking down a bone-in cut. Roast it soft and work it straight into softened butter. That marrow butter carries a richness plain butter can't touch on its own. And melted over a finished steak, it finishes the whole plate the way a proper sauce would without you ever needing to build one separately. Number 20, use clarified butter instead of whole butter when you're searing hard and hot. Whole butter carries milk solids that scorch and turn bitter well before your pan gets hot enough to really work. Clarify it first, strip those solids out, and that same butter can take heat a scorched pan of whole butter never could. Number 19, brown your butter before you ever use it to finish anything. Let it go past melted, past foaming, all the way to a deep golden color with little toasted specks settled at the bottom. Then strain it. That toasted, nutty flavor sitting underneath a finished steak is something a plain melted pat of butter simply can't give you, no matter how good the butter was to begin with. We're getting closer now to what brought you here tonight, and that tallow's not finished with its part in this either. Number 18, rest a finished steak on a bed of rosemary and thyme instead of a bare plate. The heat coming off that meat wilts the herbs just enough to let their oil loose, and that steak pulls in the last bit of aroma it's ever going to get in the couple of minutes before it hits a fork. Number 17, crack your pepper coarse instead of running it through a fine grinder. A coarse crack holds its shape against real heat and gives you little pockets of bite scattered through the crust. Fine ground pepper burns fast in a hot pan and turns bitter before the crusts even finish forming. Number 16, keep a well-seasoned cast iron pan for searing and leave the nonstick pans for eggs. Nonstick coatings start breaking down at temperatures a good sear needs to pass through without a second thought, while a properly seasoned iron pan only gets better the hotter and more often you use it exactly right. Number 15, dry age a steak a few days right in your own refrigerator if your case doesn't offer it. Sit it uncovered on a rack with good airflow around it, away from anything else in there, and a few days is enough to concentrate the flavor and firm the texture some without you needing a whole aging room to do it. Number 14, understand the real difference between wet aging and dry aging before you pay extra for either one. Wet aging happens sealed in its own bag and juice, tenderizing the meat some without changing the flavor much at all. Dry aging happens open to the air, losing moisture and concentrating flavor, while a controlled bit of good mold does exactly the job it's meant to do on the surface. Number 13, ask your counter about the flat iron the next time you're standing there. It comes off the shoulder, split clean along a seam of connective tissue nobody used to bother separating, and once it's split, it eats about as tender as a strip steak for a fraction of the price, simply because most people never think to ask for it by name. That steak under the foil is close enough now that you could probably guess how much longer it's got left, and you'd likely be right. Number 12, do not skip the offal at your own counter out of habit. A beef heart sliced thin against its grain and seared hot eats lean and honest, carrying a flavor the muscle meat simply doesn't have. It used to be some of the best eating on the whole animal before anybody decided it needed apologizing for. Number 11, render your own tallow low and slow with a splash of water sitting in the bottom of the pot. Cut the fat small, keep the heat low, and that water keeps the very first layer of fat from ever touching bare hot metal directly while it starts to melt. By the time the water's boiled off, the fat's already got enough of itself loosened to protect the rest of the render on its own. Number 10, keep your different fats in their own separate jars, labeled plainly, and never mix them. Tallow for a hard sear, butter for finishing, a mild oil for anything delicate. Each one behaves differently under heat, and mixing them together throws away the exact reason you went to the trouble of keeping them apart in the first place. Number 9, steel your knife before every single time you use it, not just when it feels dull. A blade drifts out of true a little with every cut it makes, long before it actually goes dull, and a few strokes on a steel brings the edge back in line before you ever notice it wandering off. Number 8, sharpen that same knife on a proper stone every few months, regardless of how it's steeling. Steeling straightens an edge, it doesn't sharpen one. Only a stone actually removes metal and rebuilds the edge itself, and a knife that's only ever steeled will eventually go dull no matter how faithfully you keep at it in between. Number 7, lay a damp cloth under your cutting board before you start working. A board sliding around on a bare counter fights you the whole time you're trying to be precise, and a folded damp towel underneath holds it steady for 10 seconds of trouble that saves you the whole rest of the job. Want to tell you something my father told me standing at that same block because it stuck with me longer than almost anything else he ever said. He told me a dull knife has hurt more men than a sharp one ever will, because it's the slipping that opens up a hand, not the edge itself. I didn't believe him until I watched it happen with my own eyes more than once. Number 6, A hard sear needs a hot fire and almost nothing else standing between you and it. The oldest steaks I ever ate as a boy were cooked over nothing but real coals with a grate between the meat and the fire. No gadget, no thermometer, just a cook who'd done it enough times to know by the color of the coals themselves. Number 5. Before there was a refrigerator in anybody's kitchen, a butcher kept meat cool in a deep box packed with ice cut from a frozen pond the winter before, and that ice had to last him clean through summer if he'd cut enough of it. That's not a method I'm telling you to go copy. It's a reminder of exactly how recent all this convenience actually is. Number 4, a steak needs almost nothing added to it to eat well. Salt, real heat, real fat, and enough patience to leave it alone while it works. Every single trick on this list tonight is really just a different way of protecting that same short list from a mistake somewhere along the way. That steak's foil is about to come off, and I promise you it's worth every minute you spent waiting on it tonight. Number 3, slice a rested steak on a slight angle instead of straight down through it. Cutting on the bias opens the grain up wider across each slice, which makes even a properly tender cut feel more tender still sitting on the fork, and it makes the presentation of that crust look far better on a plate than a straight cut ever manages to. Number 2, here it is, the trick off the front of this video. Pour hot rendered tallow through a fine wire strainer held right over your steak while it rests in a hot skillet, stirring nothing, just letting it fall in its own dozens of separate threads. Each thread hits already close to smoking, and instead of pooling into one flat layer the way a straight pour always would, it locks onto the crust exactly where it lands, adding a second, thinner crust of pure beef flavor directly on top of the first one the fire already built. That crescent-shaped fat you kept separate back at number 38, the trim you rendered down at number 11, the water you left in the pot at number 9, they all end here in this exact moment, finishing a steak in a way a bottle of oil poured straight from the counter could never manage. Why does the mesh matter instead of just pouring it straight? Because one solid stream of fat lands all in one place and runs off before it can do much of anything. 100 thin threads falling at once cover the whole surface evenly in less time than one pour ever could, and every single thread sets against that crust before it ever has a chance to pool up and run. Lift that steak up off the board and you'll hear the crust crackle before you ever get your fork into it. That's the whole of it. That's what turned a plain steak into what you saw at the front of this video. Number 1, and this one is no trick at all. It's a black cast iron skillet handed to me by my own father the same year I finally earned a spot at his block, already carrying decades of use in it before it was ever mine. Never scrubbed harsh in its whole life, never once bought new in mine. Every single thing on this list tonight happened in a pan built exactly like this one. The tallow rendered clean, the butter browned past melted, that steak resting under its foil. Every crust this counter has ever built. When I set that pan over a fire, I'm cooking with every hand that held it before mine did, and I can feel every one of them there while I work. A pan like that doesn't wear out. It only gets better with every single year somebody keeps using it properly, and it'll keep getting better long after I've set it down for good myself. If I stand back from all 45 of these and look at them together instead of one at a time, they're really only ever saying one thing in 45 different voices, that a man paying real attention to fire, fat, and time will always eat better than a man chasing whatever gadget somebody told him he needed instead. That was true standing behind my father's block, and it hasn't stopped being true just because the kitchen around it changed. Before I let you go, here's 5 more things that have nothing to do with any single number on this list tonight. Things a lifetime behind a block taught me that nobody standing at a counter is ever going to volunteer on their own. 1. A cold pan with a heavy steak in it heats more evenly than a hot pan with a cold steak dropped in at the last minute. Give that iron the same head start you give your fire. 2. A dull knife in a drawer is more dangerous than a sharp one in your hand because it's the slipping that cuts you, not the sharpness. 3. The cheapest hour to shop any meat counter is early on a weekday morning before the case fills back up and before the weekend crowds already pick through it. 4. A package with an added solution of water and salt printed on the label is being sold to you partly as water, and it will never brown the way a dry piece of meat will. 5. If a counter can't tell you how many days something's been aged, it hasn't truly been aged at all. Before I get to the money of it, I know what some of you are already thinking because it comes up every single time I put a list like this out. Some of you are going to say all of this is nothing but an old man's habits dressed up for a camera, and I understand why it looks that way at a glance, but nearly everything on this list either came straight out of a real tested method or has since been explained properly by people who study exactly this for a living. The old way and the measured way aren't fighting each other here. The old way simply got there first. Some of you are going to say you don't have a cast iron pan handed down from your own father, and you're going to wonder what any of this has to do with your own kitchen. And here's my honest answer. Most of this list needs nothing but a stove, a plain skillet, and a little patience. The pieces that need more than that, I told you so plainly, and I told you exactly which ones those were. And some of you are going to say a man who spent his whole life earning a living off this knowledge would never simply hand it over for nothing. And to that one, I'll only say, I've already had the whole of my working life. There's nothing left for me to protect by keeping any of this to myself. The only thing left worth protecting now is whether any of it outlasts me at all. Let me be plain about what all of this actually costs a family and why so few of these 45 things ever get said out loud. A man working the cheap end of the animal, a chuck eye one week, a flat iron the next, spends a fraction of what the same man spends chasing name cuts every single time. That gap sits quietly in every single grocery bill in this country, and there's never been any money in anybody teaching you to walk past the expensive tray. So for a very long time, almost nobody has. I've watched a man do that arithmetic in his own head standing at a case, set the expensive package back down, and walk out with something plainer instead, and there was not one thing wrong with what he carried home that night. You haven't been priced out of good eating. You've been priced out of the names printed on the label. The animal underneath those names never changed nearly as much as the words sitting on top of it. 45 things is a great deal to hand anybody in one sitting, and I don't expect you to carry all of it out of here at once. Most of it will sit with you the way things sit after a long conversation, some of it surfacing weeks from now, standing at your own stove when you least expect it. If you remember only 3 things out of everything I've told you tonight, remember to salt it early, remember to buy the whole piece instead of the tray, and remember that tallow through a strainer, the rest will come back to you in its own time, the way it always does once you've actually tried a thing with your own 2 hands. So here's your homework this week, 5 short lines and nothing more. Ask for one cut by its honest name at your counter instead of taking whatever sits at eye level. Salt something early instead of at the last second. Keep your next batch of trim instead of throwing it out. Pour tallow through a strainer over one steak just to see it for yourself, and cook one thing off this whole list that costs almost nothing, and see how your own table takes to it. And come back down to the comments and tell me 2 things. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me which one of these 45 you genuinely never heard before tonight. I read every single one of them myself. Next time, I'm going to open up that cast iron pan's whole history properly and show you exactly how a piece of iron gets from rusted and forgotten in the back of somebody's barn to slick and black and ready for another 50 years of suppers. There's a step in that process almost everybody gets wrong the first time, and I'll show you exactly what it is before I show you anything else. If you got something useful out of this one, subscribe, and the next one will find you on its own. Ask for it by name, cook it slow, feed somebody with it.